And I think that's the responsibility that we in the space industry need to hold ourselves to, is to not get so excited that we begin to think about space exploration as a way to escape Earth. It's not a way to escape Earth. Earth's going to be the best home that we have probably for hundreds of years, maybe millennia, right? And so we should be thinking about how can we make these analog technology transitions from things in space that can help us solve some of these problems on Earth as well. So I think it's a dual track.
Hey, Ariel, can you please tell us about yourself?
So I'm director of the Space Exploration Initiative at the Media Lab, and what we're focused on is the future of the AnthropoCosmos. So if we've been thinking about the Anthropocene and all the things that humans have led to for the nature of Earth and our planet, some thoughtful and intentional and some not so great and not so intentional, what's our principled approach to the future of life in space writ large? And this is where we come to this guiding North Star vision, this notion of Starfleet Academy that really drives a lot of our work. This is where the space cadets would go to learn to be space doctors, space captains, but it was also where the technology of the USS Enterprise was built. And so we love combining both of those aspects in our work. We're a very principled team. We care about democratizing access to space, but we're also building a portfolio of artifacts, of prototypes that you all will get to experience in the future, life in a space habitat, life in a space station, life in a floating city, all of those great things.
So, Ariel, we know we want to go to Mars in a giant spaceship, filled with what we think of as life here on Earth, Mm-hmm. But right now we're just going up there in tin cans and cramped, gliders and things. What do we have to do to get from here to what that is really going to be as a vision for how we travel to other planets, and then what we're going to do when we get there?
It's a fantastic question. And this gets to the heart of something that I've worked on for the last 5 years, thinking about how do we have space that scales? How can we scale our experience of space exploration? And you brought up one of these common pain points, right? Right now, space habitats in orbit are aluminum cylinders. They're tin cans. They're glorified, really amazing aluminum cylinders. We shouldn't underestimate or undervalue how much progress that they have brought for humanity, but you can only fit a space station in that model as big as you have a rocket payload fairing to fit it in, to get it up to orbit. So we're trying to think about what is a system, a new paradigm for building in space, for architecture, for infrastructure, for things that we would assemble for this interplanetary civilization that we're headed towards. And the way that I think it's going to go is we need self-assembly. So we need parts that can, in a beautiful 2001 Space Odyssey type way, self-assemble a floating dance of choreography that brings these pieces together. And then the beauty is that you can pack the pieces of your space architecture like Legos in a rocket. You can pack them really condensed, making sure that you're having all the material that you need, and then you open the payload, these Legos, these space tiles come out, can swirl around and form something much larger than the bounds of that original rocket payload fairing. So that's one of the things that you asked. I'd love to just jump in and say, you also raised this wonderful notion of we're bringing the artifacts of our life from Earth into space. We want to do that. We want to have room for all of that. But at the Space Initiative, we also want to think about what are the elements of culture unique to space that will develop in the space station culture, in the space habitat culture, in the new Martian culture? And can we design uniquely for the affordances of microgravity? So make a musical instrument that would only play in that environment, not play on Earth, something new and unique to life in space. And we're excited to build out that side of the portfolio as well.
Now, have you seen beginnings of those cultural artifacts from stuff in the International Space Station? Have you seen the beginning of how that we might think about that?
Yes, we're seeing the proto-formation of this culture in space, which is really exciting. I'll just highlight a couple projects that different members of my team are leading. So we have an astronaut ethnography program where we listen on a confidential basis to astronauts' stories of their life in space. And of course, I can't give you names because the point is it's a confidential understanding. But we have a coterie now of somewhere between 12 and 15 different really extensive interviews that we've done to understand what they're going through. What are these cultural artifacts that they're creating anew for themselves? And one of the things we hear the most about is the need for care and comfort. So this is work led by Sana Sharma and Sans Fish on my team, this astronaut ethnography. And what they're hearing is that there's new ways that your body needs comfort in microgravity, right? You can't lay down on a bed and have gravity feel like you're being supported against it on the surface of a bed, but it's really important for our mental sense of relaxation. How do you find things like that? Another crisp example is Sans Fish has developed this interesting idea for shoes. Astronauts complain that the tops of their feet get sore as opposed to the bottoms of their feet, because of course they're not walking and impacting their soles, they're slipping their feet under straps over and over again, typically in socks. And so you actually really need a sole on the top. And so Sans has this fabulous idea for a new type of shoe in microgravity, again, beautifully tuned to what you need in space, completely different, the opposite of a shoe on Earth.
I just want to jump in really quickly as a person who uses, for real, a gravity blanket. Yes. Right. Like a lot of people use a Jessie. I don't know if you know about them.
Yeah. The weighted.
And so the idea that we're going to be in a world without gravity is just like, that is one of the most profound things to think about, right? Because our entire life, everything is about gravity. How do we even think about a world with something else? Which, how do we?
Or what are the psychological ramifications of sleeping on the wall or upside down on the top of the thing? Do you find that they talk to you about those kinds of things?
They do. They share a lot of both the bliss and the opportunity of experiencing life so differently, but then also some of the pain points and some of the ways in which their bodies are changing or their mental health, is affected. NASA is pouring quite a lot of research into understanding two among many other aspects, of course, of the psychological profile for life in space. One would be the teaming. You're in a resource-constrained environment, really tiny group of people, and a tiny constrained physical space. So you need to be able to understand how you'll work well with others. And this is a really interesting challenge because NASA cares deeply about this, and the astronauts that fly are champion team members. So when we start thinking about space tourists and one-off folks who haven't been selected for this personality trait or haven't necessarily had the same psychological training, it'll be an interesting new frontier to see how people are actually able to interact and involve.
The interior of a spaceship doesn't have to be constrained by the design elements that we have down here, right? Because you have it's a 360 degree, like in 2001, you could run around the thing. Exactly. So how does that change the way we should think about design?
One of my favorite things that we say when we're trying to break the paradigm of how designers are thinking for Earth is so much on Earth is axial, right? You're in the XY space, or you're building a building that's vertical like a rectangle. We need to start thinking in 3 dimensions. So for a habitat, we should be living in spheres, not in blocks, or spheres, not even cylinders. You still see the Earth-based assumptions reflected in some of the International Space Station architecture because you're still in cylinders that have a primary axis, and even the space station arms grow out in kind of an XYZ way. Now, there's a wonderful justification for why cylinders make sense. They're good pressure chambers. But we can also begin to explore pressure chambers as spheres and growing radially. And it's not just a single object, but instead of our cities typically grow, over land, so in a 2D plane, and maybe a city like Tokyo is also really growing up. But in space, we can grow up and down, left and right, and have space cities that evolve radially out of a core as opposed to on a plane. So that's kind of a macro sense of the different shifting for how we think as a designer about some of these affordances.
Now, do you and I have spoken about Star Trek many times. I'm not a Star Wars person, I'm a Star Trek person. Vast teams working together for a common goal. We could go on about that forever. But how much do you look back at science fiction? How much do you look back? Because a lot of these design challenges have been explored with different filmmakers thinking about how they might put something together. Of course, they're only really doing the control room and a couple of the bedrooms. They're not doing the whole thing. But are there lessons that can be learned from looking at different versions of the way other people have thought about this?
Absolutely. J.J. Abrams recorded a video for us a few years ago, and I think he sums it up beautifully, which is, if I'm to paraphrase his video, there's this cycle between creative envisioning and science fiction and the engineers that are inspired by that to build the future. And then the next generation of artists see what's been built and say, oh, let's do something different. And so there's this wonderful cyclical inspiration that goes back and forth, this dialogue between creative endeavors like science fiction and our engineering and scientific endeavors at the Media Lab. Of course, we're also trying to unify all of these pieces in together at once. So what's special about our team is, yes, I was trained as a physics person and then aerospace engineering, but we have artists and designers and philosophers and people thinking about ethics, in addition to the scientists and engineers on our very same team. So we're really trying to bring all of this interdisciplinary perspective together.
And in this case, it's vitally important because you're really trying to imagine a whole new world. And you know, I mean, we have a few governments that go to space. We have a few billionaires that are going to space. It's a pretty small group. Why should everybody want to go to space?
So I think there are a couple different answers for you for this, and it depends on your philosophical persuasion. There's the interest that many humans, perhaps not all, but many humans have in the beauty of exploration. So seeking something new just for the sake of new knowledge, of new experiences. And we've seen this throughout human history, people setting off to explore and understand more about our planet. I think we have a real responsibility to think ethically about this in the future and make sure that we don't replicate the patterns of colonization that took place on Earth, the really fraught history of colonization, but we can think about it in a more ethical, enlightened, perhaps Star Trek Prime Directive inspired way. So getting back to your question about how science fiction inspires us. That's one reason, because we seek new knowledge. We have this drive for exploration. Another more reflective opportunity and why we would want more people to go to space and experience it is this notion of the overview effect. It's profound. The astronauts, almost every astronaut has a story about this when they've left Earth, right? Which is in itself something we take for granted now, but is a huge step. You're leaving Earth. You see it from space. It's a beautiful blue, fragile marble. And it grants many of the astronauts that have this moment, this opportunity for the overview effect, it grants them a certain seriousness of purpose for environmental causes, for saving the planet, for understanding. And so we think of space exploration as another opportunity to expand our concentric circles of awareness and purpose as not just, US citizens, but as global citizens, as Earth citizens. And I think it's a really powerful opportunity to have more people share in that.
When you talk about democratization and this idea, we still have all the problems that we have here.
Yes.
And the inequities and I love that you have the ethics part of your team. How would we think about that? How would we include people? Like what are some ways you're thinking about doing that?
Yeah, so we think about democratizing access to space in a few different ways. One of them is, can we bring new people into the creation process and the dialogue from the very beginning? So this is saying yes to artists and yes to biologists and yes to social theorists who want to be thinking about it with us. So that's part of it. It's a fields-based approach. Then, of course, there's making sure that our teams are diverse so that we're getting all kinds of different ethnicities and racial backgrounds and socioeconomic and international backgrounds, actually hands-on designing these artifacts for life in space. Because if we appreciate the richness of cultures on Earth, we need to be intentional about ferrying that richness and that diverse tapestry back up with us into space as well. But there are other dimensions. So democratizing access to space also means that we need to design space, not just for the 1% of human talent, which is astronauts, but we need to design the med bays and the playful entertainment and the space food. We need to have a gastronomy culture in space that appeals to a broader segment of Earth's population. So there are all of these different layers to what we mean by democratizing access to space. And we try to really think thoughtfully in a number of different interpretations of how we can reach that goal.
Now, Elon wants to go to Mars, but if we went to Mars, it's not clear that any sort of framing of a governmental nature would actually have any effect, because once the, I don't know what you would call them, but once the travelers got to Mars, they could rethink everything, right? Like in terms of how they want to live, because they're living there. It's not like we're going to say America's in Mars.
Well,
right?
you're asking about government and constitution and accountability. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question there.
These are huge questions. And again, with science fiction, we see people like The Expanse, right? The Expanse series. And there is a fraction between Mars, and they become adversarial in the beginning of the series. Hopefully this is not a spoiler for anyone who has yet to dig into Expanse.
Okay.
It's a great question because we can't control, even if we had some perfect, UN-like global system with rules, we can't control the unfolding future of humanity indefinitely and how we're going to think about all of these governance questions. But just because we can't have minute control over what will happen, there is a responsibility to not cede our other responsibilities for thinking about how we can have it be as beneficial as possible. And one of the most interesting analogs that I think human society is going to face soon around the existential threat of climate change is geoengineering. Do we do things to our planet at a global scale where an effect that we take with aerosols in the atmosphere in one place might affect someplace all the way around the globe? If we can learn governance models for taking care of Earth as a shared community, I think we should begin to also think, as we're building these discussions around climate change and existential threats to humanity, let's build those governance models with an eye to the future of saying, we also need to apply these to the surface of the moon. We need to be thinking now, because so many companies, international partners are already jockeying for influence, for territorial rights, for property rights on the moon. Let's think about it also in the context of Mars and Elon's work. Let's make sure that we are starting to lay the foundation for global governance. And I know for some it's a utopian goal. They say, the UN, we have these bodies, they're just not doing it. But if we don't ask them to do it, if you don't ask, you're saying no to yourself. And so we might as well start now, I think, towards some of these governance goals.
As we're thinking about it, are we allowing for other life on other planets and include that? How are we going to, we're coming into perhaps somebody's home.
Such a thoughtful question. So the space industry does care really deeply about what we call planetary protection. So this is why the Mars rovers, for example, before they're allowed to leave Earth, they're baked out, is what we call them. So they're essentially sterilized to make sure that we are not transporting our own microbes to Mars and interfering with what may be later down the road discovered there. And then also to make sure that if we were to discover life on Mars, which would be a huge claim, that we can be pretty certain we didn't transport it there by accident. And so that we really know that what we're discovering is new life. There's a huge responsibility to think about not in some way diminishing this possibility to honor life that might be elsewhere out in the universe. And a lot of astrobiologists are thinking about it, but it poses quite a hard challenge because we don't know for sure that all life would be carbon-based life, which is what we know for our biosignatures, DNA, nucleic acids, carbon-based life. So how do you search for other forms of life if you don't know the chemical makeup or the structure? And it's a really interesting, thorny challenge that a lot of astrobiologists are thinking through right now.
Are there lessons that can be learned from the way that we've sort of thought about the ethics around AI or like in synthetic biology where we haven't thought about them at all, or nuclear proliferation where we haven't really, that maybe a little bit better, but not much better? Are there lessons we can take from that in terms of thinking about this new frame?
That's really interesting. My gut reaction is yes, we should be thinking about, in some of those contexts that you raised, we have frameworks for action. And even if we haven't completely solved the challenge of nuclear nonproliferation, we do have a series of frameworks guiding and a principle for why that's really important and is honored among different, even hegemonic competing powers for the most part. Yes, so I think some type of an intentional framework modeled on what we have learned about human society and how we can kind of carry those lessons forward into the future for a thorny problem like planetary protection. Yes, I think that's a really interesting framework to try to build on.
We've taken a lot of astronauts to space around the world, right?
Yeah.
From all the cultures that can afford to send a rocket ship into space. But I would imagine if we interviewed all of those people who've gone to space, you'd find similarities, whether they were from Japan or Russia or here. You would find they go up there and they have a feeling about becoming an environmentalist from looking at it. But if we just start ferrying people to space, we may find that a lot of these people are not that same kind of thing. How do we sort of, how do we want more people to go, but how do we do it so that it remains safe and they don't mutiny the ship? And, how do we,
I think I'm hearing something else, Jesse, in your question, which has to do with the sacredness of it. I mean, you think that we look at the science fiction or we look at work, there is that spiritual, godlike experience, to be, like you said, away from Earth. How are we going to ensure that same care, that we don't always see here? That's kind of where I'm hearing part of what you're saying, Jesse, because it's like, how do we, so it doesn't like you're going to Disneyland, you're just jumping on a rock.
Because you would need a lot of different kinds of people up there. You might need a police person, you might, which right now we don't even think about that, but you might need a person like that up there,
Yeah, I think you guys are hitting on this really interesting tension where we don't want to cheapen the experience, but we also want to democratize the experience. And so how do you preserve this sacredness if we also want it to be a domain where it's really open and a lot of people can go and begin to participate? And the way that I think about this in some ways is you can look back at the model of airplane travel, right? In the 20th century, in the early to mid 1900s, it was still a very unusual and relatively rare thing outside of the military to have civilians flying on airplanes. But over time, an economy built up around a purpose for which people would travel, for business, for pleasure, for connecting different countries. And although it certainly has by no means solved all of the conflict on the surface of the Earth, I do think that the cultural exchange that has been brought to humanity by air travel is a really wonderful outcome. Now, we can think about it in a similar way in that, yes, even low Earth orbit seems really sacred to us now, but maybe the purpose of NASA and other space agencies around the world will continue to push further out. So as we begin to populate low Earth orbit and it becomes maybe a perhaps more commercial domain, this near Earth cocoon around Earth, we still have the leading lights of our society thinking about the sacredness and pushing out towards Mars or pushing out towards Europa, one of the most interesting potential targets in the solar system for life, right? With all of the liquid potential on Europa. And so there will be this balance of Earth's commercial activity and the breadth of people that can get involved in allowing, mining types or policemen or artists who want to have a practice in low Earth orbit, giving them space to develop these opportunities around the Earth while still having a sense of our responsibility to the vastness of the cosmos and making sure that the behaviors and the patterns of commercial activity that we start to allow are seeding responsible, thoughtful use of the space commons, right? Because space is an ultimate commons.
And as a commons, ultimately, it's going to be valuable when we build an economy, right? There has to be something that we take from Mars back to here and something we take from here to Mars, and we create this economy. How, right now, if Elon had his way, he'd already be on the way to Mars. But how long will it take to really get to Mars? And then how many years? I mean, I think it's, correct me, obviously, but it's like hundreds of years to get it really to be built. Yeah. I mean, where there's a spaceship that's giant in space where we can go up to it. I mean, how long do you think it takes to actually build that?
It's a great question. So right now, the space industry, the big buzz is trying to say, how do we even get a cislunar economy? So a moon-based economy, even before we can think about what would be the economic justification to go out to Mars. And what we're realizing is that the business cases don't all close yet, but there's beginning to be so much interest burgeoning in different industrial sectors. So there's a bunch of different landing companies that want to get involved on the moon. There's an interest in prospecting for water, which could be used as fuel in situ to get us from the moon as a gateway out further deeper into the solar system. Maybe there's something in mining regolith, whether it's on the moon or in the asteroids or ultimately on Mars, that's interesting. But likely for Mars, we anticipate, maybe the first human missions in the 2030s, but it would be decades before we would see a self-sustaining economy keeping up the flights and the exploration to Mars. I think it's still going to be a government as an anchor customer, and then philanthropic individuals like Bezos and Musk thinking about the future for Mars. And then the hope is that we have enough leverage to make sure that the governments of the world, if they're acting responsibly, can influence the activities of these independent actors, right? The privatization of space travel to still, if the government is still your anchor customer, at least the government should be able to say, we want you to abide by these principles when you're acting on.
Do we have to solve some problems here on Earth with COVID and, you know, food security and water security before we can really do this in earnest?
I think the answer is in parallel. So there's so much about the space age and the technological developments that came out of Apollo that improved the quality of day-to-day life for humans on Earth, that I think it would be a mistake to be ostriches and put our heads in the sand and say, yes, there are dire needs on Earth. We're going to only look there and later we'll get back to space. I think the most effective strategy for humanity is to say, what can we learn from space exploration, resource-constrained environments, our understanding of, you know, technology, everything from water filtration on the ISS to how we're handling microbes and potential epidemiological issues, and make sure that that's coming back down to benefit life on Earth. NASA has this long tradition of space spin-offs. It's Kevlar, microwaves, LASIK eye surgery, water filtration, all of these things that came out of the space age. And I think that's the responsibility that we in the space industry need to hold ourselves to, is to not get so excited that we begin to think about space exploration as a way to escape Earth. It's not a way to escape Earth. Earth's going to be the best home that we have probably for hundreds of years, maybe millennia, right? And so we should be thinking about how can we make these analog technology transitions from things in space that can help us solve some of these problems on Earth as well. So I think it's a dual track.
Now, at the current time, you have to take everything with you up there, you know, but you don't necessarily need to build, you know, a lot of times we think about space, you got to build these hard walls, you got to build, are the materials literally different that are up there that are needed to do what we need to do?
There's an amazing class of materials that we should be exploring. I love this question because structurally, you still want things that are hard, so that they're able to resist the force of pressure. Because when you're in space, you're going to have a lot of pressure on the inside trying to escape out, right? So you still want hard exoshells, but maybe we can use this as a chance to actually finally do carbon fiber architecture instead of aluminum or steel everything. But then on the inside of a habitat, where it makes sense on Earth to have a hard kitchen table because you need to set it down and make sure the thing doesn't fall away, things on the inside should be soft. We should be thinking rubbers, silicones, morphing architecture that can be a chair and a bed and a table and that weighted blanket that Priscilla wants. You know, we should really be thinking about innovative materials across a whole spectrum of what we would call in the engineering business moduli, strength moduli, you know, Young's modulus. We want kind of all of these different suite of options materials.
And what about like the food? I'm so interested because it's such an important part of our life, you know, and if you lose your appetite, you know, you can get really depressed and all of that. How are we thinking about, you know, really exploring what's possible?
This is really one of the flagship areas for the space exploration initiative that we lead at MIT. In addition to space architecture and the industrial design of artifacts, Maggie Koblenz on my team is leading what we're calling this emerging field of space gastronomy. So her particular passion right now is thinking about fermentation. These are foods that humans have loved for millennia. So beer, wine, miso, bread, you know, fermented sourdoughs. And not only do we love them, so they have a certain mental health component, which is really important in space, but also fermented foods, whether it's, you know, miso or kimchi, they often have microbiome benefits. So probiotics or microbial benefits for the overall human health. And we'd like to be able to say, it also helps with food waste, right? So we have really constrained food loops and ecosystems in space. How can we have a revolution in food for space so that we're not just eating freeze-dried ice cream, which actually, spoiler alert, the astronauts do not eat, but they do eat freeze-dried almost everything else. How can we have a revolution in the quality, the umami, the taste, the flavor, and the enjoyment of food, while also still having food serve its really core nutritional goal?
Have any Michelin star restaurants come forward, Michelin star chefs come forward to collaborate with you about what we could do?
So I'm nodding yes, but I can't say the name. We are working.
I have one question to that point though, because some of the things that you just name are also things that are found in the sea, in the bottom of the sea. And so, Jesse and I were talking about earlier, we were on our last podcast, we were talking to an underwater cinematographer, and like what's left to be explored at the very bottom of the sea, and how much do you take that learning there and apply it? What's relevant, for example, on something like food?
Yes, very interesting. So algae is a huge and relevant piece. You just kind of hit it right on the head. Algae is one of those closed loop food ecosystems where it's relatively easy to grow in an ISS environment. It's less dependent than, say, an oak tree on that gravity gradient. So really learning where to put your roots and where to put your shoots, which is the challenge for growing more traditional plants in space. And so we're thinking that with hydroponic systems, algae might be an interesting, relatively successful plant to grow. Now, of course, still more research going into that. NASA would have more to say to you on that. But then it's a plant that we can eat. Now, how do you get people to enjoy algae? That's the question. There are some cultures who love seaweed salad. I am one of them. I like seaweed salad. But how do you get that to be something that is really playful and also enjoyable? And one of Maggie's kind of marquee concepts is this notion of algae caviar. So you spiritualize, almost like boba. So it's a little bit bigger than actual caviar. It's more like boba or bubble tea, tapioca balls. But can you have this, closed loop food ecosystem in space where you take it from growing the algae, the astronauts are able to get the nutritional benefit from algae, which also has some really interesting health benefits, but also make it playful. And then the other side of that, which we don't often talk about as much, is the recycling the product after it comes out of the human back into other systems for the space station.
And so that's you serve it as caviar again.
Nobody wants to talk about that, but I mean, we don't have to talk about it on this, but that I'm sure that is like a whole thing to be thinking about, right?
Yeah. It is. I mean, resourcing the strange environment, you've got to make the most of all the fluids. That's what I'll say.
So I'm sitting here, I'm at home now, and I've got my books, and I've got, these couches and chairs and different things. And this is kind of the way I want to live, right? Like I have a little fire going, not the fire part, but just,
cozy.
Pictures. Yeah, it's like a nice little thing. How do we make that in space? You have certain people, they're religious. You have other people who are, you have all these different kinds of people. How do we bring home up above the atmosphere?
Such a great question. One of our industrial designers, Sans Fish, in the Space Exploration Initiative, has this interesting ability to understand the fact that the very sterile, super futuristic, white, silver, clear aesthetic that seems to really happen with space, right, isn't going to be homey enough. Maybe some people will love it. Those modernists among us who want really stark interior homes, maybe they'll love that. But Sans is working on a series of concepts that would be, you can imagine it like a Victorian couch in 3D. How would you cuddle into a plush Victorian couch that's not just, a single long log, but is circles around you, can be communal, can bring people into a shared experience of sitting or relaxing, and then feel playful because you could only have a couch like this in 0G. So I think that this is an area of research where for so long we've been focused on survival in space, surviving. We're beginning to have the luxury, because we're standing on the shoulders of giants like NASA, to think about thriving. Right. And so in our team, making that bridge from just surviving to thriving is something that we're really excited to think about, and finding that sense of home is a big part of that.
And do you have companies and designers and different people getting excited about collaborating with you about these kinds of ideas? And where do you explore them? Do you explore them in what realm? Augmented reality? Like where do you explore it right now? Because I assume you go up in those ships that go up and then come down, and you have 0G, but that's probably not the design elements, or maybe it is. I don't know.
It can be both. Yeah, so the short answer is yes, we are really excited to work with companies. There's a certain subset of companies that we work with through the Media Lab Consortium. So everything from exploring, the future of space chocolate to the future of space health, and various treatments and drug delivery and things like that. But we're always looking for new insights. So if there are other companies that want to get involved, we actually really encourage them to reach out to us, because we want to be thinking about that full palette of products and things that those companies might know that their customers or their market cares about, that we want to be thinking of in a new way in space. And for the way in which we visualize the design potential, some of it is old school. So some of it is we'll work with an artist, we'll do a render, we'll have the scientist or the engineer or the designer convey in a very iterative loop the ideas behind a piece of research. Maybe we'll show them the prototype, we'll show them a video of it working on zero-G, and then we'll try to capture the essence of it in art. And I think that the reason that that's really important is that still to this day, storytelling around space needs to catch up. It needs to no longer paint a picture of exclusive or just a survival frontier. It should paint a picture that just you look at it and you want to live there. You want to explore it, like your next vacation, your next special place to go. And I think art and storytelling is a really nice way to get that sense for people that they can see themselves in that future. That's what we want. We want people to see themselves in that future.
I have a question around, you've used the words playful and joy, which is so great to think about this. And all I can think about is like bringing like dancers into this conversation, because I think the way that, the body will be able to move and just imagining what is possible.
Jeez, I won't be able to go if that's
You're not going to go. No, but you won't have.
What do you mean? Of course I'm going. I mean,
No, but I think about like the ability to, even again, explore the human form and like different, always say like, I need a new perspective. But, in yoga, whenever I do a headstand, which I do a lot, it changes everything about my day. And I know that's silly, but for anyone who does yoga, it really does. So thinking of what dancers can bring as well in terms of not only just visual artists, do you have this? And obviously you talked about music and what's the musicality of what's going to be possible and the kinds of instruments. That just sounds incredibly exciting to me. Are you doing anything like that?
We've had one member of our team begin to explore this thread. And like a thread, I think we can unravel it into so many interesting directions. We were inspired by Kitsu Dubois, who is a French woman who, years before we were taking our whole team on microgravity flights, she would charter just for herself a microgravity flight and she would choreograph a dance. And she was learning how to control your body because your intuitions are completely different, right? We learn with our legs our entire life how hard we have to push to move ourselves. And if you push that hard in microgravity with your legs, you'll zoom across the entire cabin and you'll bang your head on the ceiling. So she's recalibrating her body to what you really need to do to have graceful, controlled motion in zero-G. And inspired by that, Xing Liu, who is not only our arts curator for the Space Initiative, but also a performer and a fashion designer, she's created 2 different suits for herself. One was called Orbit Weaver. So it was modeling her motions on that of a spider, because relative to their size, they actually, and the strength of gravity, they actually do move quite freely through space, if you think about how a spider moves. And then the other suit was called Molastica. And it was inspired, getting back to this conversation we were having about the deep sea and analogs, it was inspired by sea creatures and how they move in water and in a buoyant environment. And she designed this absolutely gorgeous, I don't know whether we call it a dress or a spacesuit, but it's something in between. And it just flowed with her in this most beautiful way as she was performing a dance on one of our microgravity flights, on one of our Bonnet Comet zero-G flights. Right. We have a wonderful video somewhere. Maybe I can send that.
Yeah, let us know. Well, I want to see that, and maybe we can kind of post it.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about, Ariel. I think you have to come back.
Yeah.
We could have run out of time, and
would love to.
I mean, maybe bring some of your colleagues with you, or maybe, because I want to hear about the food. I want to hear about there's so much to think about. And I honestly, this is the first time I've really been excited to think. I know I probably won't get there, but for some of the people watching, hopefully they will. It's just a different.
Although it's hard to get you to fly to Denver, so I don't think.
True. I don't like to fly. It's not. I mean. I'm not a big flyer, so although Jesse and I have had to fly all over the world, but it's just so much that you're doing that is just
it's super inspiring. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about this. It's really appreciated, and just as always, look forward to carrying on the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It means so much to me that you both can see yourselves in this future and that you would want to go along, because that's what we're trying to do. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful conversation.
Yes. Nice to talk to you, Ariel.
It's great to see you both. Bye-bye.
Bye.